Hello and welcome to Major Film Reviews on YouTube. Today is my very first video review I will be doing, and I will be looking at Spiral from the Book of Saw. So the horror genre has somewhat of a reputation for overstaying its welcome when it comes to franchises. This is probably best shown by the numerous franchises started in the 1980s, whether that be Nightmare on Elm Street, whether that be Friday the 13th. They all have one thing in common: they were sequeled to oblivion until the point of the original film was completely lost in the mix. I'm not sure the same thing can be said about the Saw franchise, to be quite honest with you. It's never really been particularly one that I was fond of. I think particularly because of the graphic, detailed nature of the traps and things like that. I'm usually not one who's too bothered by blood, guts, and gore and all that kind of stuff in the context of films, but that kind of detail in such the ways the Saw franchise portrays it, it's really a bit of a turn off for me. It kind of makes me uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable in the way that I feel that someone somewhere is enjoying this a bit too much, and that knowledge of it just puts me off it even more. But that being said, I was interested in Spiral mainly because I thought it seemed like a different take on the franchise. Perhaps it was a story that was conceived by its star Chris Rock, had a serial killer mystery angle to it, which I'm quite fond of, a kind of a murder mystery story. I like it's almost sort of a guilty pleasure because it's such a well-worn trope of storytelling of trying to figure out the killer before the film shows you who it is. And that was the parts of Spiral I enjoyed the most, was the kind of twists and turns of the mystery of where it was going. There were times when it did wrong foot me. There were times when I thought it was going to be one thing, it turned out to be another. It wasn't an entirely satisfactory conclusion, because the one thing about murder mysteries is the mystery stops being interesting the second that you explain it, and there are ways around that, because you can have interesting explanations and interesting conclusions to the story, but Spiral just didn't really nail that conclusion for me. It set up many possibilities and wrong-footed its audience, but in the end, the final explanation just kind of fell a bit flat. In cases like this, when a film sort of teaches you to expect one thing, you kind of reverse psychology into believing that it's not going to happen, because that's what films do. They make you believe that one thing's going to happen, and then they wrong foot you and then do something else. And this was the case here. They kind of set it up to make you believe that, I'm just going to call them X and Y as the characters, so as to not spoil it, to make you believe that X or Y might have been the killer, but instead Z was the killer, and Z was someone that had been forgotten about for the past half an hour, so it was completely sort of out of your mind. And that kind of wrong footing can be satisfying, but I felt like the explanation of his character was very weak. His sort of justifications and things like that, they were strong parts of the film. The focus of the film about it being sort of surrounding the police department, that was a very strong base for it to build upon. So it was sort of killer that was going after corrupt police officers, which you can argue is a relatively timely angle to take, given the last few years. Although it doesn't really have a prevailing message like that. I think it's just a case of it being a setup. As any other. And from that sort of solid foundation, it doesn't really give you a whole lot of character development. I would say it introduces some interesting aspects of characters, but never truly fleshes them out. I liked Chris Rock's character in Best, for instance. I thought his sort of, but in a way that I was liking Chris Rock's character for him being the parts of Chris Rock that I like, as opposed to him being a version of a character I like. There was a lot of kind of his fast mouth, loud mouth style that he's known for. Nothing particularly new or interesting, but in a way that works, in the sort of way that works for people like Kevin Hart, who have a specific area that they excel in, and it's fun to watch them in that area. That was very much the same for Chris Rock. Samuel L. Jackson as well was. The character dynamic between him and Chris Rock was fairly underwhelming, shall we say? It was very kind of stereotyped, it was very one note, and it fell sort of flat to the point where, like, both characters seemed more unlikable for their interactions with each other, which I don't really think helped the film all that much. In terms of other characters, they weren't necessarily characters, more like they were just versions of police officers that you've seen in countless other films. Then they're just sort of the different levels of police officer, like the corrupt police officer, the lazy police officer, the racist police officer, just the different levels of different tropes that we've seen in police officer characters. There was nothing particularly new, nothing particularly groundbreaking, which I think the setup could have been a good setup to do different things with it, but sadly wasn't. Visually as well, I feel like it didn't do enough to set itself apart from its franchise. I think the selling point of the film for me was that it was a film within an established universe but trying to do something different. But eventually, when I actually got to the film, it felt like they wanted to do something different but weren't comfortable with it and weren't convinced that it was going to be successful, so they kind of went back to their safe zone, which was a shame, because I feel there were parts of the film that were really interchangeable with just the rest of the franchise. Like, you could have taken certain scenes from that film and it had been from any sort of film at any point in the franchise. There was nothing to particularly set it apart from what had come previously. I know that there's an established lore and established story to follow, and that's a good thing, because when you've got an established story like that, and there's opportunities to explore it further, that's a good foundation to start a new story, and that foundation was completely skipped over in favour of, as I say, kind of going back to the safety blanket in a lot of ways. There were a lot of things they could have done differently to make it more interesting. They could have had a sort of deeper mystery around the serial killer character. It was only it's only really short in terms of films. I know that most modern films tend to be going a bit longer nowadays, but this was only 90 minutes and it ended really abruptly too, which, again, in that typical sort of horror trope, just feels like it's leaving a line for a sequel, really, which is disappointing, because it felt like a story that could have been served just as well as standing on its own, as opposed to setting up for more inevitable sequels in which the series can continue to circle the drain. By the way, whoever comes up with those traps for the Saw films needs a whole lot of serious therapy, because those things were sadistic. Like, as I say, I have quite a strong stomach for on-screen violence, but without wanting to give too much away, it's the detail, I think, in the blood and gore in this that makes it more unpalatable for me. Like, I've seen kind of films where they've been shootouts with a lot higher body counts that have not disturbed me as much as what happens in the Saw films. But again, that's very much a thing of personal taste. You might be able to see past that and enjoy them for whatever reason you enjoy them. But it's the knowledge that someone is enjoying it a little bit too much that eventually puts me off these films. And there wasn't enough to the murder mystery, to the serial killer angle, to make it really stand out from the franchise. So I think in the end, I was just really disappointed with Spiral. I think it could have been a whole lot more. The characters were occasionally entertaining and endearing, but they weren't enough to really save what was a very safe, familiar film in terms of the franchise, and what was quite a big disappointment, really. So, if you've seen Spiral and have any comments, any differing opinions, I'd love to hear them down in the comments. Try and keep it civil. Next, I'll be looking at, let's see what I've got next. I've got Cruella on Friday, and I'm seeing A Quiet Place Part 2, and I may well have some other things to fill in some parts. But if you have any requests, any comments, any differing opinions, sound off in the comments. Just try to be civil. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the review.